Hello and welcome back to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. I'm Lando, and this video is part of Beyond the Western Front, a collaboration between myself and 6 other channels, all about the impact of the First World War outside of Western Europe. So when you're done watching this one, be sure to check out the full playlist linked in the description below. Okay guys, enjoy the video. Gallipoli, a small town on a rugged peninsula that forms one side of the Dardanelles. The vital corridor to the Sea of Marmara from the Mediterranean, leading to the port of Istanbul. The peninsula sticks out into the Mediterranean like a feather. It is hot, rocky and undulating, with high ridges and steep cliffs. In 1915, a large Allied expeditionary force of British and Imperial troops, supported by a large French force, descended on this place, hoping that if they could seize the straits, they could threaten the Ottoman capital. It did not go to plan. Allied landings in April were contained by the Turkish, who inflicted heavy casualties on them and contained them to a number of beachheads. Progress was painfully slow, and every yard, hill and gully was bought with blood. British commanding officer Sir Ian Hamilton was now faced with a protracted campaign of attrition of exactly the sort that the Allies had wanted to avoid. Looking out at the terrain over which he would have to fight, he was put in mind of his service on the northwest frontier and of a particular type of soldier, the Gurkha. For almost 100 years exactly, the British had been allowed to recruit the tough hillmen of Nepal into the famous regiments of Gurkha rifles. Although Nepal and Britain had started out as enemies in 1815, after the wholehearted support given by the Nepalese during the Indian Mutiny, the two countries had become firm allies. Nepal was never annexed to the British Empire, and it remained remarkably independent, so much so that until recently the British had technically been forbidden from recruiting within Nepal itself. When war broke out, Nepal's pro-British Prime Minister Chandra Shamsher threw the country firmly behind King George's government. He wrote that the whole military resources of Nepal are at His Majesty's disposal. We shall be proud to be of any service, however little it might be. This military support included not only encouraging young men to enlist in the Indian Army, but also in sending regular battalions of Nepal's army to act as garrison troops on the northwest frontier, freeing up Indian Army units to go abroad. The labour of recruitment was also shouldered by the Nepal Dabar, which already maintained a large home army. As of 1913, Nepal's population numbered some 5,624,000 souls, and it had seen steady population increase since the turn of the century. A correlation of sources say that between 1914 and 1919, 200,000 Nepalese volunteered for the army, of which 100,000 were mobilized into the Gurkha regiments, and approximately 55,000 men were recruited into the National Army. Some 20,000 would be killed or wounded in the course of the war, and between 1/5 and 1/10 became casualties overall. 3 battalions of Gurkhas from the 6th, 5th and 10th regiments would fight at Gallipoli. They came to this foreign place disoriented, unsure and anxious, but they also had an abiding clarity of purpose that overrode these things and helped them process what was going on, that being to find the enemy and kill him. Every ounce of fighting spirit would be needed in what Lieutenant Colonel Charles Granville Bruce, the commander of the 6th, said was one long nightmare. The 6th landed at Gallipoli first, not long after the landings at Anzac Cove, and joined 29 Indian Brigade. General Hamilton's wish for Nepalese troops was not only driven because he wanted experts in mountain warfare, but also because there was a prejudice in the British High Command regarding the Indian soldiers then serving against the Turkish, many of whom were Muslims, and it was thought, unrealistically, that they would have qualms about fighting their co-religionists. Therefore, the Gurkha regiments would rotate with currently serving Indian Army units that had large proportions of Muslim troops. The commander of the 6th was a big man with a love of mountaineering and a good joke. Colonel Bruce was exactly the sort of personable, intrepid and capable officer the Gurkhas liked to serve with. Whilst the brigade was in reserve, he and his senior Gurkha officer, Subedar Major Gambar Singh Pun, made a thorough reconnaissance of the Turkish positions, and they were not kept in the rear for very much long after that. Their first test was a 300-foot cliff at the edge of the Archi Baba Ridge. Led by the Subedar Major, the 6th scaled the eminence at night under cover of a naval bombardment and charged the unsuspecting Turkish with their terrifying knives and drove them back 500 yards, leaving a collection of severed heads behind them to advertise that the Gurkhas had indeed arrived at Gallipoli. This part of the line was then renamed Gurkha Bluff, and throughout the summer Gurkhas continued to serve as a sort of spearhead against difficult positions, fighting through the battles of Krithia, but casualties from enemy fire, disease and general attrition were high. By the end of May, the 6th had lost all their British officers. Now, 35 days after they had landed, the 5th and 6th had lost over 130 men, and the 2nd Battalion of the 10th had lost 40% of its riflemen and 3/4 of its officers. Indeed, 2 months after arriving, even the indomitable Colonel Bruce was invalided out, and his second-in-command, Major Cecil Adanson, took command. General Hamilton was nevertheless pleased that during the June battles, which cost the British contingent over 3,800 men, in the seesaw struggle for Gully Spur, the Gurkhas had got into the enemy with their kukris and sliced off a number of heads. But after these trying times, the Gurkhas were pulled out of the line and sent to the island of Imbros for a rest. They spent a month there, and they would need this time for recuperation because their greatest ordeal lay ahead of them. When they returned, it was August, and the Empire forces had swollen like a festering wound by 20 to 25,000 men, and some were living like burrowing animals, while others lived semi-vertically in cliffside warrens, like seabirds. The objective now was to attain a lodgment in the Turkish positions, but principally that beyond Anzac Cove. The Sari Bear Ridge runs parallel to the sea dominating the Anzac position. From the main ridge, a series of spurs run down towards the level beach, and separated from one another by deep gullies choked with dense jungle. Hamilton, to whom this crisp description belongs, described Sari Bear elsewhere as a lofty mountain range. Between the 8th and 9th of August, the Turkish struggled against a massive push to break the Sari Bear line, and spearheading the assault was General Monash's division, which included Cecil Alanson's 6 Gurkhas. Alanson was a 38-year-old Welsh regular and didn't like the plan, and his men had been lying out all night after pushing to within 70 feet of the objective. He had actually ordered the advance himself, when no orders had come due to High Command losing track of where the division was during the initial phases of the attack. But when dawn came, they were ready. After the naval bombardment had ended, Alanson counted off 3 minutes on his watch and ordered his men to advance. The attack went in, and against the odds, the 6th found themselves in possession of the top. And for a moment, despite poor planning, confused orders, and dogged resistance from the Turkish, it looked as if the 6th were going to capture the ridge. But Alanson's men were unsupported, and he pushed on from the crest, hoping that he could give himself room to dig in. Unfortunately, although the charge bit deep into the Turkish position, revealing a brief glimpse of the enemy's rear, the heavy artillery shells were dropping on the ridge from Alanson's own side. This, mixed with the fact that there were still no supporting units in sight, made things very untenable. The 6th had gone as far as any British unit would get, and without help, and with casualties mounting, Alanson himself being hit, he had to order the retreat. Getting back to their former position, the medical officer of the battalion, Captain Phipson, did his best to patch up wounds and get people back in the fight. He did his best for Alanson as well, despite the fact that Phipson had actually been knocked off his feet by friendly fire himself. And it was now, when talking to the battalion commander, that he realised he was the last British officer still on his feet. a replacement for Allenson from the 53rd Seats, was killed almost instantly upon arriving with the battalion. So the doctor was now responsible for getting everybody off the ridge. Around him was the overwhelming evidence of the courage of the Gurkhas and the mad waste of war. Men constituting the majority of the battalion lay all around him and were being ported in, bleeding from bayonet and rifle wounds and mangled by artillery fire. Those hit by the bombardment were stained a horrible yellow colour by the lyddite filling of the shells. Phipson was a solid officer, and he played his part excellently, but as Allenson moved to the rear and took his leave, his last words to Phipson took the weight of command somewhat off his already burdened shoulders. Do all you can to help Gamba Singh Pun. This was a subtle exchange of command. Technically, so long as a European officer was present, the Subadar Major remained his subordinate. But Allenson knew that Gamba Singh Pun was possibly the finest officer in the regiment and effective senior officer. Not only that, but Phipson knew it too. He would remain in official command, but more capable hands would get the last of the 6th to safety. Once he had discharged his duty to the wounded, he removed his Red Cross brassard, and drawing his revolver, went in search of reserves to relieve the battalion. No one could or would help. That night, the Gurkhas were plagued by snipers, some of whom worked their way forwards to within 30 yards of their position. Dawn came without relief, although it had been promised at some point the day before, but now orders came out from HQ. Phipson was to retire. Luckily, Gamba Singh Pun knew his business, and Phipson was a good organiser. The de facto commander was an old veteran of the northwest frontier and knew by heart the proper drills and regulations, both written and experienced, for the efficient evacuation of pickets under fire. Fixing on his intention, Pun quietly and carefully explained it to the doctor. I marvelled, Phipson said, at the precision in which he described the different phases of the retirement and the proper precautions to be taken, such as the removal and disposal of the bolts of the rifles which could not be taken, of surplus ammunition, collection of stores, destruction of equipment, and the timing of the movement itself, to retire 900 feet down a rocky declivity, intersected by deep and narrow gullies, many of them choked with corpses, and the infinitely difficult job of carrying down the wounded. Medals and commendations were the reward for Gamba Singh and Phipson, Allenson too, although he always thought he should have got a Victoria Cross, and knew in his heart that they would never break through after that. Generally, he wrote, it would now look as if things are at a standstill and deadlock. It will cost us thousands if we are to break through the Turkish trenches which now envelop us, and it would cost them more considerably, I trust, if they try to break through ours. Winter is approaching. The weather at night is very cold, and we hear no breath of fitting us out for the winter. I have no idea what the future holds forth, what our subsequent movements may be. I can only speak of the narrow front we hold, and one knows little of what goes on elsewhere. We have had our chance here and have missed it. Towering above us is the Sari Bear ridge, on which we should have been safely ensconced, and we are not. And had we held it, Achi Baba and Krithia must have fallen. I never looked up on those rugged heights without a sign of bitter regret. The winter months at Gallipoli added a fresh element of torture to the Allies, and accounts from the Gurkha regiments speak of men freezing to death on sentry duty rather than abandoning their posts, and nightmarish instances of foot rot. Eventually, the High Command decided that the campaign was a lost cause, and a mass but brilliantly executed evacuation occurred in early 1916. This was done with incredibly light casualties, considering the attrition of the last year. Lieutenant General Savory served with the 14th Sikhs in the campaign, and said that the 1st Battalion 6th Gurkhas were the outstanding battalion of it. Many Gurkha regiments were now reduced to groups of 100 and 200 men, from 1914 strengths of 800 men and upwards. A massive strain was put on the recruiting centres in India and Nepal, and drafts of men not usually selected for British service were being welcomed into the regiments. Yet there was no doubt that the Gurkhas had cemented their 100 years of service to the British with exceptional valour and sacrifice that marked them out as some of the finest troops to serve in the Great War. In January of 1918, Sir Ian Hamilton's secretary replied to a Christmas card from the battalion HQ of the 6th Gurkhas, and it read, "It is Sir Hamilton's most cherished conviction that had he been given more Gurkhas at the Dardanelles, he would never have been held up by the Turks." Okay, thanks for watching, guys. This has been a video from the Beyond the Western Front collaboration. If you want to see more, please head over to Rifleman Moor's channel, where he has a great video about the Mesopotamia campaign in the First World War. Thanks to Brandon F., who is the mastermind behind this collaboration. If you haven't seen his video, which is before mine in the list, please head over there as well and check that out. Thank you for watching. As always, I'm very grateful. Please hit like and subscribe on the way out the door, and I'll see you again soon for another adventure in Historyland.